Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Perfect RIA podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Jarvis, and on today's What Works Wednesday, we're excited to have Cameo on the show to talk about where to start on systems, right? We all want to have more systems and processes in our practice, but often that becomes like this daunting thing, like maybe I need a 100-page employee manual, and so we give up. And so, Cameo, really excited to have you on the show today.
Yes, thank you so much, Matthew. It's great to be here and sharing with your listeners.
Very exciting. Well, for our listeners who don't know about you yet, tell us a little bit about you and the work that you do.
Yeah, so I am Cameo Roberson and founder of Atlas Park Consulting. We are a practice management agency helping financial advisory businesses unlock their growth plans and accelerate revenue. So over the course of 15 years working for firms in the San Francisco Bay Area, I had a number of roles, whether it was client support, compliance assistant, operations professional, director of operations. So I learned very quickly what goes into growing, building, and scaling an advisory firm. You know, those areas between clients, custodians, and the advisors, what we want to have happen, and then what actually happens. And so I've built a consulting practice to really help advisors who are less than 10 in size level up in the areas of practice management and grow strategically in the way that they want to.
I love that. You know what? Right away, I can tell that you really know what you're talking about because you mentioned custodians. I hear, like, I follow a lot in the industry. I know you do too. And I've never heard somebody mention, hey, how this relates between you, your client, and your custodian, as if this custodian is this magical thing that none of us have to work with. But as you obviously know, that's a major factor, right? Be it Fidelity or Schwab or TD or wherever you're at. If you can't communicate with them effectively, none of this works.
Oh, it's game over. And I have war stories, you know, when it comes to working with custodians, but it's like advisors need to understand, how do you coordinate all these pieces? How do you still show good face to your clients? How do you make sure your team does what they're supposed to do? And then everything happens in good order at the end of the day. It's a big feat.
It is. How about, I love that we're going to talk about custodians. I think so often advisors feel like they're just at the mercy of the custodian, right? Like the custodian says, here are the things. And sometimes they just throw up their hands like, well, I just have to do this way because it's what the custodian said. But you've already sort of alluded to, yes, there are things that the custodian says have to be a certain way, but that doesn't have to diminish the client experience.
No, it definitely doesn't have to diminish it. But what it does is puts the responsibility on the advisor or on the team to do what I call professional pushback. You hear things from a custodian that don't seem right. You want to be able to trust your gut. And if you hear something that's just not quite right, and you know that your end client isn't really going to resonate with that, then ask questions. I always tell my clients is to ask questions around why we are doing things a certain way. Why are you telling me this answer? Because ultimately, if you get wrong information from your custodian, what happens? And you tell your end client that, you talk about a recipe for eroding client confidence if you don't have the right information. And those pieces that we don't always think about goes into your client experience.
Yes. Yeah, it does. Well, let's pick an example if we can. I would suppose that cashiering or money movement, different custodians call it different things. It's probably one of the most common things, right? So the client calls and says, hey, I need X number of dollars for whatever. That can be one that can really kind of get dicey. And I think a lot of advisors are very reactive when that happens. So how would you coach somebody through creating a process through that, right? So your team member gets a call from your client, hey, I need $50,000. Mm-hmm. What happens next?
Great example. What I would do is hopefully the advisor is utilizing their CRM, right? And they're capturing that information. If the client is called, you definitely want to record that somewhere in the client notes. If you're really savvy, you already have a workflow in place to process that move money action. But if you don't, you at least have the notes in the CRM, right? Because you want to capture that information when the client calls their request. And then you also want to confirm which account the money is coming from. That's a big one.
Yes.
The last thing you want to do is pull the money from the wrong account. Additionally, you want to make sure that the wiring instructions or the ACH instructions on the client's account are accurate. That's a step in your process as well. And then if the move money paperwork is already on file, like say with Schwab or Fidelity, and the link has already been established, then you just want to go in and make sure that there's enough cash available. So you may need to talk with the lead planner to make sure that you can generate enough cash for that transfer. And all these steps should be documented somewhere in your workflow process. Once that cash is ready, then what you want to do is make sure that you verify the transfer with the client again, especially if it's come through email. Because you think about all the cyber issues, cybersecurity we have now, these criminals are getting savvy and they're getting access to clients' email addresses. And so have a mechanism in place to reconfirm that transfer, then go in and make sure the cash is available, process that transfer, make sure it goes through, because Matthew, you and I know things happen.
Yep.
And then the final step is make sure that you communicate to the client that the transfer has gone out.
Love it.
And once you've done that a number of times, just document it in your workflow so that you don't have to recreate the wheel each time this request comes in, because guess what? It's going to happen again, and it's going to be another client next time. And then even more so, you can train your team on that process.
I love, and I hope everybody listening picked up on this, Cameo, that you weren't just like making up these steps. Like I could tell as I'm listening, like this is a process you have thought through. It wasn't like, well, because in some offices, you and I have both been here, you go to some offices and the request comes in and it's sort of like, well, what do we do? I don't know. And then the distribution request goes in and there's not cash in the account, or who's on first. I just want for our listeners to get like how intentional and precise this is. But it also wasn't 50 steps, right?
Right.
I love this. Sorry, I love nerding out on these processes. I'm so excited.
We're in the same boat. No worries. No worries at all.
So for an advisor who's listening to this and he's saying, hey, Matthew, thanks for making fun of me that I don't have a process. Like, what would step one be? So if an advisor is listening and they heard these steps you listed out and they said, oh my goodness, we only have 3 of these and 2 of them are me as the advisor, I have to figure out what's going on. Where would you start on this?
That's a great question, Matthew. I think what I would start with is think about what process you're trying to figure out first, right? There are hundreds of processes that you may have within your practice. So if it's your onboarding process, or if it's the move money process, or even a new account opening process, start there and figure out, okay, if I'm opening up an account at a custodian, what are the steps that I need to have in place in order to do that? Start there. And then move on to the next process. Maybe that's the move money if you only have, say, half of the processes listed out now. And then you build from there. And that's literally how you're able to build in those right standard operating procedures, or SOPs, that are going to support the day-to-day work that you're doing and delivering for your clients. And that's one aspect. But then when you think about the firm management as a whole, there's another set of processes and procedures that you may want to have in place. You know, we haven't talked about the whole compliance bucket, but that's a whole thing in itself. And you can apply that same methodology that you use with building out your client support processes into your compliance, into your business development, into your enhanced workflows, even within your CRM. And that's the beauty of it, is it can extend into other areas.
Yeah, it really can. Of course, I love this idea of building it into the workflows of your CRM. I know I've been tempted in years past. We once did this really elaborate employee manual and then no one ever read it, right? It's like, oh, there was 30 pages on how to open an account. No one read that. But if it's a workflow in your CRM and it's kind of going step by step.
It's a game changer. And you want to hear something else? If you really want to get fancy with it. So you can build in, just depending on the CRM that you're using, right? And you think about leveraging your team. So what I found, Matthew, is in the absence of process, people make things up. And they make things up because they don't know exactly what to do next. And so they'll do what's most comfortable. You can build in conditional logic into, just depending on which CRM, not all of them offer this. Whereas if certain steps aren't completed in their entirety, the workflow stops.
Yeah.
Which kind of forces people to follow the process that's been identified.
Sorry, I was just writing down your quote. In the absence of process, people do what's comfortable. And
yeah, they make things up.
Yeah, they make things up. That's right. They make things up and they do what's comfortable.
And so if you really want to, incorporate strong processes and a consistent delivery of your processes, then you have to think about having these mechanisms in place. And it could be as simple as if someone is opening up a new account and it goes through kind of this check process, right? To make sure that you have everything that you need. Because the last thing you want to have to do, I used to hate this with clients, is have to go back to clients for more information.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just painful, right? But if you build in, this checklist ahead of time, make sure that you're getting what you need at each step, that reduces your frequency of having to go back to clients all the time.
Well, I'm thinking more about this. Sorry, I get fixated on things, making things up, right? So that's really a way as an advisor to be sort of introspective, right? If a team member comes to me and I'm sort of just guessing off the cuff, well, hey, I think the next step is this, then I'm guilty of making things up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think Fidelity will let us do that. Just go ahead and try it. Oh, we can't just try it, right? If it bounces back, if the client gets stuck, what's going to happen?
Absolutely. And so it then puts the burden and responsibility on that advisor to think through their own process and how things should happen. And then communicate to your team, because your team is an extension of you. And if you're not training them and giving them what they need to be successful, then you're doing them a disservice and you're doing your clients a disservice. And what often happens, I've seen, is when people don't feel supported in the work that they're doing, if they don't feel they've been trained well, then expectations get misaligned. People get dissatisfied and they end up leaving. And there's a lot of turnover in our industry. And I know that I really feel like that's one of the big reasons why is people aren't set up for success.
Well, that's really interesting, especially now when it's so difficult to hire talent, right? The talent that you have. But it's interesting, Kevin, I'm loving this discussion. And correct me if I misunderstood this, but if you have a team member that's not meeting expectations, odds are that they just don't have the training and support in place that they need.
Quite possible. Yeah. We expect them to hit the ground running and know and can read our minds in terms of what should actually be happening. And we should never make that assumption. We should also always have some sort of formal training process in place so that we set our team members up for success and they can thrive from day one.
Totally. Well, and of course, it's a moving target, right? We've talked from the beginning of this episode about custodians and the paperwork that's constantly being changed, and what worked one month won't work the next month. But yeah, this is a good lens. Like, what situation or what systems are you putting in place so that your team thrives?
What systems am I putting in place?
Oh, I'm just kind of for advisors as we listen, right? Like, am I creating an atmosphere where my team can thrive? Or to your point earlier, am I creating an atmosphere where they just have to guess and make things up?
Yeah. What I would say, one of the biggest areas that advisors can really think about, creating this system for their team members to be successful is to take a look at their roles and responsibilities, right? That job description that was used to hire them, and use that as a framework to figure out what your training process should be. So for example, if someone is going to be, the chief paperwork officer in the office and will be opening up new accounts, you want to make sure that there's a strong training framework in place for them to open up different types of accounts across multiple custodians, if that is your situation. Then you have put something together that's in complete alignment with their role on your team. And you can also avail yourself to different resources that custodian may have in terms of modules or training and being able to open up new accounts. And so that's just kind of one high level area that advisors can think about building out within their practice. And then here's the beauty of that. Then you tell the team member, you've gone through this training, you figured out how to open up new accounts. Now it's your responsibility to make sure our process manual is updated. You've effectively delegated.
Oh, sure. Let them own it.
Yep. But you must train them first if you want them to own it.
I love this idea of the title of chief paperwork officer, right? Versus it's like, oh, Dave takes care of the forms, right? Which is sort of like getting dumped on, right? But no, you're a key member of our team. You're the chief paperwork officer. It's critical that you're making sure all the paperwork's getting out. And back to this environment of success, right? This is a critical piece of what we do. This isn't something we also have to do.
Right. This is a critical component of it. And it really can communicate from day one how dialed in you are with the process. And your end client is going to feel so well served when they know they're getting right paperwork with their right information, and then the paperwork is processed in good order. The last thing anyone wants to get is a NIGO, right? And that's a not in good order item, because those can cause more frustration. And then you have to go back to the custodian and it becomes this endless cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Sorry. I'm so excited that you get all these terms and you understand the industry so well. Well, Kevin, this podcast, and I feel like we could talk for hours on this subject. We'll have to come back on and do some more episodes together. But Absolutely. This podcast is about taking action. What action items would you give to advisors? So we have all these listeners, right? There's some 60,000 a month, which is amazing. If they're looking at this and they're saying, what do I do next? Like, what could I do this week? What would you give to them?
Great question. I'd say one of the first things any advisor of any size should do is to think about where they are in their growth. Do they want to accelerate their growth? And if they want to do that, what's one bottleneck that's keeping them from there? Take that one bottleneck, figure out a strategic plan to deal with that bottleneck and start there. So if it's, for example, you want to be able to grow your networking presence and you want to build relationships with more out of the box COIs, meaning people that your end client can really benefit from. We've just gone through and are still living through the realities of COVID, right? And so people need all types of support. You know, your out of the box COIs may be therapists or certain mental health professionals, right? And so if that's an area that you want to expand in, pick that and then figure out what your best next steps are to build relationships with more of those people. Once you tackle that, pull up the next bottleneck and deal with it.
This is really great stuff. I love this. I love this out of the box COI idea, right? We think of like accountants and attorneys, but there's so many things, right? Therapists or home healthcare or any number of things, even just a painter or something.
Absolutely.
So that's really exciting. Well, Cameo, how can advisors get a hold of you, right? And we'll definitely schedule more of these episodes because this has been so much fun. But how do advisors track you down when they say, listen, Cameo's got this figured out, like I need to call her? How does that look?
Yes, please call me. I do have it figured out.
Clearly, you have something figured out. Yeah.
But you know, I'm a business owner as well. And so I'm still learning it as well. But people can find me at atlasparkco.com. That's my website. Or they can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, as well as LinkedIn, Atlas Park Co.
Very cool. Well, Cameo, thank you so much for your time today. Like I've got a whole page of notes here for people who can't see the video screen. Like I've written a whole page of notes. So there's things I'm going to go and implement in my practice. Thank you so much for your time today. And for all our listeners, until next time, happy planning.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
My pleasure.